Welcome back to Communicology. Today I'd like to talk about diversity, but not just any kind of diversity, viewpoint diversity. What's viewpoint diversity? Well, quite simply, the idea is that we could have different viewpoints about all kinds of different things, and that's okay. Now, before we jump too far into this, let's back up a little bit and start looking at some definitions. And you'll notice diversity, of course, is a very common word today. A lot of times it's used in a pejorative sense as a negative, and sometimes it's used as a very flowery positive, but it's a word. And just like any other word, it has a definition. And as we've talked about with word meanings in previous episodes, it has a denotative meaning and it has multiple connotative meanings. So denotatively, what is diversity? So you look at the idea of multiple things, and it could be whatever. So you get a diversity of color, you have a diversity of food, you get a diversity of thought, all these different things about which you could have diversity. So you have all of this collection of different things, and they're just brought together. And now, when you think of diversity, you'll notice that word's also used elsewhere. Like, for example, I teach at a university. So wait, diversity, university. Okay, so those words have a lot of similar feel to them. Well, probably never thought of it before, but a university, you have all of this diversity that's brought together in one place for one shared goal. And it's typically, when you think of the idea of a liberal arts education, it's to have this big collective capturing of all of these different things. So I think about learning some history, learning some math, learning some science, some geology, I just all of these different things, in addition to, of course, your major course of studies. But you think of all of these different things that are out there that you just grab together towards this one path, and that's being a well educated person. So I go to college to study, not just to go get a job, but to go be a more well-rounded person. I mean, I can be a citizen now, not just of my community, but a citizen of my country and a citizen of the world, because I've been well-rounded in my education. So I've got all this diversity in one. So university. So the idea of diversity in and of itself is quite normal, and it's quite good, because, again, I like to eat a diversity of food. I'm not a fan of just one singular thing. Sometimes students will ask, if you could be stuck on a desert island and you only get one kind of food, what would it be? And that's kind of hard. I mean, you might have a go-to thing where you say pizza, but even then, I kind of like a diversity in pizza. Like, sometimes I want just a plain old just pepperoni pizza that just, Sometimes I want something a little bit different, maybe a little bit more special. Maybe you're the kind of person that likes pineapple on a pizza. Frankly, I do, but not everybody does, and it gets people fighting. So we're not going to get people fighting today. But the idea is, when it comes to a diversity of food, we tend to think that's a good thing. I own more than one shirt. Every day I go to my closet and, what do I want to wear today? So today I wanted to wear a blue shirt, so I picked that one. Maybe tomorrow I'll wear a white one. I have no idea. Tomorrow is a new day and I'll think differently tomorrow. Who knows? But I come home and I take off my shirt, my tie, my jacket, and then I put on a hoodie, or I put on something else. Just whatever I feel like wearing that day. I like the diversity of clothing. It's great. I've got a diversity of books behind me. I've got everything from economics books to public relations to theology, to humanities. I've got this huge swath of different books behind me. Again, it allows a diversity of understanding of how the world works, how communication works, and how people communicate. So again, diversity is good. Now, when it comes to people, I love the diversity of people. I was fortunate enough, I was actually quite blessed. My mother was a secretary at a university, and she did that for about 30 years. So I basically was born and raised on a university campus. So all I knew was the university experience as far as all the different people that came from all over the planet. Now, this particular university, my alma mater, Slippery Rock University in Western Pennsylvania, Slippery Rock had a very, very good international program. And at any given time, there might be 50, 60 different countries represented on the campus. That's a lot. And, it's just, maybe has about 8,000 or so students at the time. So we're looking at, 50, 60 different countries in the 8,000 students. Most of them Americans, sure. Most of them from Western Pennsylvania, sure. But there's still all of these different people from all over the globe that you're just constantly running into. And the professors were the same way. So my mom, of course, would work in academic departments, or she'd work in administrative departments, and I'd constantly be bumping into all these different employees and students of all of these different backgrounds, and it was just fascinating, and it was just always neat to learn. And of course, the food was different too. I will never forget getting a chance to have baklava. When you go from never knowing what baklava is to having baklava, it's a wonderful experience. So it's a great thing to have that kind of diversity. Now, the one thing that is missing in a lot of places, we see it in academia, we see it in Hollywood and entertainment, and we see it in the news media, is the concept of viewpoint diversity. Now, that's someplace where I love that to exist, but some places don't. We've talked before about echo chambers, and how it's dangerous, like when you get into a situation and you've curated your friends list and things like that, or you get stuck in an algorithm and you only get fed the same viewpoint all the time to the point where you think that that's how everyone thinks. And frankly, you get to a point where you like it that way. That's the dangerous part, because you get into an echo chamber, you think everyone thinks the same way, and then someone comes from out of the blue, and you're like, I can't. I don't know what's going on, because that's not the right thought. You're supposed to have this thought. This is the right thought. That's something else. It's probably wrong. Now you can see a problem. Now, viewpoint diversity allows for, again, a diversity of thought. So I think one way politically. You think another way, you another way, another way. Now in America, of course, we have this one big blind spot with this, because we tend to think Republican, Democrat, and there's just like two ways of thinking. In reality, that's not true. If you're in the two-party system, sure, there's Republican thought and there's Democrat thought, and there's actual, you could actually study those things. So there's actual thought that happens within each party. But within each party, there's also a wide swath of things that happen in those things too. So you could be like super hardcore conservative, or you could be very liberal and still be in the Republican Party. So you could have a whole wide swath. You could even be, libertarian and kind of fit in the Republican Party. But if you get to a point where you're quite liberal about a lot of things, well, then eventually you leave the Republican Party and you end up in the Democrat Party. Now, you could be conservative and be in the Democrat Party, but if you get conservative enough, you'll no longer fit there and you'll have to go to the Republican Party. But that's how we kind of look at things and think of things. So we tend to have this bipolar view, and it's one way or the other. But the truth of the matter is it's very wide. So you could be absolute, socialist, communist, totalitarian, and be over there on the left and be happy with your thoughts over there. Or you can come over here on the right side of things and say, well, I want to be super orthodox to the point of maybe even anarchy. Like government should be so small they just don't even exist anymore, and just have total chaos from anarchy. And then everything in between. So tyranny and anarchy and everything in between, that's a huge swath. And maybe you're some offshoot from there, like libertarians, they typically pegged with the right, but a lot of times they have a lot of left-leaning views, like on abortion and things like that put them firmly over on the left side of things. And then you have like environmentalists, which a lot of times puts them on the political left. But when you start talking about conservationists and things like that, there are a lot of those that find themselves in the right. So because like hunters and stuff are very focused on conservation efforts. So you can see how things can get messy, and why just saying it's this party or this party, that's a messy way of doing things. So you can also see where it's a problem when you start excluding thought, because again, if you are in an echo chamber and you think everyone thinks just like you end up having a problem. A perfect example of that, to where you see an echo chamber to the extreme, is the latest the way that for the past few years J.K. Rowling has been treated. She, of course, as you know, is the writer or creator of the Harry Potter universe. Very much a left-wing person, very proudly left-wing. She's left-wing on 99.9% of all issues. But if she's off of on one, and people who demand total 100%, they want her basically silenced and removed from any kind of viewpoint, to the point of trying to cancel her work, disavow her work, and everything like that, because she doesn't have a 100% loyalty. Now that's an echo chamber. Instead of saying, okay, your views on this one issue are different than mine. That's interesting. Oh, you have 3 issues that are different. You have 10 issues that are different. You have, 90% of your views are different than mine. That's interesting. The idea of having conversation has gone away, to the point where you'll see almost total, control, in areas of academia, media, and the news. You'll see that kind of thing, just totally explode to the point where it's all one side. So, for example, if you look at inside the Beltway, inside the DC metro area, the journalists who cover news, 95% plus, typically when they do surveys, are self-admitted left. Well, how do you think they're going to cover things on the right? First of all, they're not going to recognize their views. It won't make sense to them. They won't want to try to make sense because they're so embedded. If it was a 50-50 split, if the newsrooms were split 50-50, then they'd have to wrestle with things, because you're going to have a wide swath of people on the left, a swath of people on the right inside that newsroom, and you'd have a huge diverse area of opinion. And they'd have to wrestle with things, and they would keep each other in check. So if the right winger is being biased, the left winger will hold them accountable. If the left winger is being biased, the right winger will hold them accountable. If everyone's on the left, who holds them accountable? Same thing in academia. Walk into any college, any university, you're going to find that a place that is supposed to be built on the free expression of ideas and the wrestling with truths almost exclusively to the left. You even colleges that say, no, we're conservative, we're Christian, we're whatever. You're going to find that actually they're not as conservative, they're not as Christian as they say. Just start asking some questions. Start looking around. Start seeing how they decorate their offices. Start looking at the names of their departments, and you're going to find out real quick they're not. They might have a good chunk over here, but they've got a decent chunk over here still. Now, that's not to say that that's a bad thing. It's one of those things but it could be, what I would call false advertising. If you claim you're here, but you've got a lot of people from over here, you really can't claim you're here anymore. You'd be better off saying, look, we're a place where learning happens. We've got people from the left and people from the right. That's how we do things here. It'd be better if they were honest, But the truth of the matter is, the vast majority of colleges, vast majority of universities, all to the left, all to the political left. So, it's one of those things where if you go to a class and you have a different viewpoint, and this has been an issue for 30, 40 years at least, where you walk into a classroom and say, is this professor going to treat me well? I happen to be a red state person. I was raised in a red state mentality home, and now I'm in a blue college. Will I be treated well? And then you have the big question, do I just spit out what the professor wants to hear and get my A and move on? Or do I stand up for my beliefs and maybe get a C or a D or even an F because I dare have some different beliefs? And you'll see that in occasional news stories where you see somebody some student suing a college because they were discriminated against because of their political beliefs. And that's a very common thing, or maybe even their religious beliefs. Because again, you see situations where you see folks heavily in the political left, especially folks heavy in that worldview, that they don't have. I mean, that worldview is their organized religion, and there's a lot of disdain for Christians. So a Christian going into a secular university often is very heavily targeted. I remember very distinctly at university where, in my undergraduate, my philosophy professor was very much anti-Christian, hardcore left. And as soon as he found out that I was a Christian, he made every day, his blood sport of trying to get me to change. Like that was his calling, to try to get me to change. Ended up making me more battle hardened, but so it did the reverse effect. But that's what happened. So instead of saying, "Wow, you're a Christian, that's interesting, let's have a dialogue," he instead is like, "That's the wrong thought." And keep in mind, this is 30 plus years ago. So, when we look at this kind of stuff, what's it like now? And of course, me being in, again, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, I was born and raised on a college campus, and and it's one of those things that I have seen colleges my whole life, and I've seen them change, and they've gotten worse every year, to the point where, good luck if you are conservative, good luck if you're Christian. It's going to be a long, hard road. Either you're going to have to pretend you're someone you're not, or you're going to be in for the fight of your life. And it's very hard because, again, viewpoint diversity would be great if colleges embraced it. If you were in a situation where you were allowed to have thought of your own and actually engage and engage and learn more about it, you'd be way smarter. Because if the professor and the student could basically like feed off each other instead of butting heads, they're more like let's learn. What a cool world that'd be. Now, the other thing too that comes into play is the idea of we talked about this before about like, can you ever get rid of bias? And the truth of the matter is, well, no, you're human. You're not going to get rid of bias. So think how much that taints things. But if your bias is, I'm always right and people who have different opinions is always wrong, that's going to be very damaging to a student. I've had colleagues before that just plaster their door with every possible left-wing sticker and cause and news clipping they can possibly imagine. If you're a Republican student and you're going to that door, or if you're a Christian student and you're going to that door to knock to go talk to your professor about a problem, you're going to instantly be met with the door and see that you are not welcome. In fact, you're not wanted. And that's a very sad thing, because you'll see colleges that are very, very blue in a very, very red section of the country, and they're trying to convert every kid that comes in that door instead of trying to learn from them, or just basically teach them. Whenever I go into my classes, I work hard to be as non-political as possible, just because my politics have nothing to do with what I'm talking about. If I'm talking about public speaking, sure, you might talk about the way certain presidents speak, and it's always fun to talk about each president and things that they did well and things that they did poorly. But it's a good way of examining and talking about, going one by one, going back the line of history, and showing how they could do things. Or certain athletes or certain stars when they give speeches. I mean, you can't get away with it when it's award season and they're giving speeches and you're dissecting speeches. I mean, it's there. But the thing of the matter is, my political beliefs, my religious beliefs, none of that really come to play when it comes to how to construct a good speech. To have a good introduction and have some main points and a good conclusion. It just doesn't belong there. I just stay to the material because, well, that's the way I've always was taught that it should be. And frankly, if I want to learn the material, that's how I learn it. I don't need a lecture on this political evil of the day. I'm talking about building speeches, or if I'm talking about, effective group communication, do I need to go off on a tangent about the president? No. Do I need to talk about this injustice that's going on somewhere else in the world? No. So I'm focusing on the topic at hand. So you have this point where, people who are in those echo chambers end up making them so solidified that the people who dare go near them, they're not just pushed aside. They're not just told they're wrong. They're condemned to the point of trying to get them out at all costs. And you'll see that often even in hiring practices in Hollywood. You'll hear about conservatives or Republicans or Christians getting blacklisted. You'll hear that in the news media, how they're drummed out because they have the wrong views, and how dare they. And you hear that in academia. You'll see hiring committees that behind the scenes will quietly tell you, you're not going to get an interview. You're the wrong person. We're looking for this other thing. Wink, wink, nod, nod. So again, it's one of those things that viewpoint diversity is very critical to have. You don't want to be that person who is so stuck, so indoctrinated in their own ways that they can't even appreciate that there's other thought out there. I mean, you can just feel the sense of pride oozing from it that, oh, I might be wrong here. Or, whoa, there might be a different viewpoint than what I have. I mean, people really get upset with that for some reason because I guess for the most part, people just don't like being wrong. But in the end of the day, you have to understand that there are lots of other views out there. It doesn't mean you have to accept them. It doesn't mean you have to adopt them. But you should be willing to hear them. And you should be willing to exist with most of them. I mean, some of them are awful. Like if you had like a cannibal, we don't need that viewpoint. Thank you very much. But, but of everything else that you think this way and I think this way, let's have a discussion. And we could still end up disagreeing, and that's fine. But at the end of the day, we've had a discussion, and now I understand this broader aspect. Besides, at the end of the day, if I know another viewpoint, it strengthens my understanding of my viewpoint. And if I can defend my viewpoint, I know it much better. And then I can really decide that, yeah, my viewpoint is right. Or, you know what, I need to modify my view and maybe adopt a little bit of this or a little bit of that. Or maybe just chunk it all together and get a whole new one. But the other way, the only way I would know that is I've heard other viewpoints and I'm willing to have that wrestling match. That's how wrestlers get better. They don't get better by just standing there and having people throw roses at their feet. They have to actually grapple with someone else and best them. And that other person comes with a different move than that last guy had, and they get to become a better wrestler, and then they become a much more whole person. So if you'd like to be a much more whole person, wrestle. Get that viewpoint diversity coming and wrestle with it. And wrestle with your own ideas too. Don't be afraid to wrestle with your own ideas. Viewpoint diversity is a very good thing. Embrace it and go with it from there. Thank you very much for tuning in and listening this long. As always, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you didn't like what you heard, that's okay. Thank you for hanging out this long anyway. But we'll see you next time on Communicology.